Welcome everyone to EFA Talks, our monthly get-together with members and guests to talk about topics of concern in the digital rights space. I'm Rita Mac, Vice Chair of EFA and your host for today's talk, Stepping Stones to Dystopia. Firstly, Electronic Frontiers Australia acknowledges and pays respect to the past, present and future traditional custodians and elders of this nation, and the continuation of cultural, spiritual and educational practices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So thanks everyone for joining us. We really appreciate your support, especially our members, and also to ThoughtWorks, who connects us all together. As many of you know, EFA members have been promoting and protecting digital rights in Australia since 1994. We are indebted to so many people who have championed and progressed this organisation to what it is today. In fact, it is this organisation and organisations like EFA at the forefront of digital rights in this country that are mitigating these stepping stones to dystopia, which is of course the topic of our talk today. But we have choices and a different future is just certainly possible. So today we're going to unpack some of the things EFA does and how, with support from its members, it's able to advocate for digital rights, challenge oppressive legislation, and hold those in power to account. And two power engines behind this organisation are our panellists today. Justin Warren, EFA board member and member of EFA since 2001. Now, he does have another life, a managing director and founder of PivotNine, Pty Ltd, a boutique consulting firm based in Melbourne. He writes for many publications, including Forbes.com, CRN Australia, IT News, and The Saturday Paper. And of course, Angus Murray, EFA Policy Committee Chair and EFA Talks founder and regular, who is also a partner and trademarks attorney at Irish Bentley Lawyers, law lecturer and director and member of many other organisations, including the Queensland Council for Civil Liberties, Legal Forecast, QLS Innovation Committee, and the IP and Technology Committee. So it's great to have you both on the panel today.
Thanks for having me, Rita.
Thanks, Rita.
So if anyone actually has any questions, can you please put them in the Q&A or our chat, and we're going to be answering questions as we go today. But first we're going to start, Justin, if you can just sort of give us a snapshot of what EFA has been doing and the current landscape that we are finding ourselves in.
Sure. And thank you for the lovely introduction. As you pointed out, EFA has been around since 1994, so that's nearly 27 years now, I think. And we have been protecting and promoting digital rights, which we like to think of as human rights in a digital context, which is anything to do with computers and the internet, really. And we've been doing that, trying to do that for, a quarter of a century. Hasn't all been smooth sailing, as anyone who's been paying attention for the last 20 years has noticed. There's certainly been a lot of advances in legislation and, well, indeed the internet and the way that's evolved in 25 years. The life for us with the internet and society around us with computers has changed a lot in that time. So we're seeing, unfortunately, where we are right now, a lot of what we predicted back in 1994 and 25 years ago, a lot of that has come true. Not all of it is good either. So what we're trying to do at EFA is broadly is to have more of the good stuff happen and less of the bad stuff.
Excellent. Angus, we've got a lot of new people that are listening today, which is actually fabulous. Would you be able to just talk a little bit about what digital rights is?
Yeah, thanks, Rita. I agree with Justin's snapshot summary that it's effectively human rights as they're engaged in the digital or electronic environment. And when I say human rights, the easiest source to point to is the December 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was a proclamation about a number of fundamental freedoms that should be enjoyed by all human beings. In the preceding decades post 1948, the advent of a widespread and mass disseminated internet has performed society, and the way that we interact in that electronic environment engages human rights in a novel way. I see digital rights as a human right subset, effectively having the same source as many of the human rights do, or the fundamental freedoms do, and that is that human beings should be entitled to operate autonomously and with dignity in the way that they operate. Those concepts underpin some of the primary human rights that we talk about and address with electronic frontiers, like the right to privacy, the right to free speech, the right to political opinion, and in some contexts, the right to freedom of movement. And I'm sure all of those rights will theme throughout today's discussion. I also think that there's an important differentiator with a subtly different, although very similar concept of civil liberties, or digital liberties, if you will. And that is the way that individuals interact with their state. So the powers that the state have in relation to their citizen. And that is a subtly different context and positioning than human rights, which covers the totality of human beings, as against interactions between state and citizen. And I think, as Justin alluded to, the technology that's developed over the last quarter century has been profound, and it opens up a lot of new opportunities. Those opportunities are both positive and in some cases negative, and I'm sure we're going to get through quite a few examples of both the positive and the negative.
Excellent. Can we just talk a little bit about the sort of submissions that we do at EFA and why that is so important before we move into the future submissions?
Yeah, so EFA has a long history, obviously going back to 1994, of making submissions and putting policy positions towards parliamentary inquiries and other law reform processes. Over the last couple of years, I think it'd be easy to categorise EFA's work as predominantly in the space of electronic communication surveillance, or bulk surveillance regimes. And the easy ones to pick up from that, Rita, are the numerous and very lengthy submissions that were made between 2013 and 2015 in relation to the mandatory metadata retention scheme, and then more recently the assistance and access legislation and the significant coalition of civil society organisation submissions that were put through the process of the bill being introduced, and then through a variety of subsequent inquiries, including the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security prior to the passage of the bill, the Independent National Security Legislation Monitor after the bill had become an act in force, and then subsequently in the review, both of the metadata retention and the assistance and access, again before the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. More recently, in that same surveillance vein, we've had submissions in relation to the Identify and Disrupt legislation, effectively a series of state-sponsored hacking provisions that's sitting before Parliament at the moment. And we weren't invited to give evidence on that to the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, but we had a fairly comprehensive submission into that process, and we're waiting for a report. Outside of the electronic surveillance remit of Electronic Frontiers Australia, we've also put countless submissions into things like digital driver's licenses, copyright law reform, the Career Australia Free Trade Agreement, and the consequences that agreement had on intellectual property rights and the rights of foreign rights holders enforcing their right in intellectual property rights into Australia. And we've also been involved with, since its inception, before the existence of the Digital Transformation Agency, the Trusted Digital Identity Framework, and that's been an ongoing consultation process that has a fairly significant consequence on Australia, because in one school of thought, it's like the 1980s Australia card, just in digital form, which for anyone who is concerned about the Australia card, electronic tokenisation of identity is probably more scary than a physical form of tokenised identity. But that's a snapshot of what we've been doing over the last couple of years. The submissions that we've put and our policy positions over the last quarter century are all available on the website, efa.org.au. And I encourage anyone who has any interest in anything where human rights might touch the electronic or digital world to have a look through the website. And I'm sure there's something that will interest everyone in all aspects of that very broad remit.
Mm. Yeah, and as you point out, Angus, a lot of these different submissions all they sort of intersect with each other, which is what the topic of today is about these stepping stones to dystopia. So you brought up the Australia card, and now we're doing digital identity. 25 years apart or longer, we still have the same sorts of ideas. We've had internet filters come up time and time again. We've had lots of things to do with copyright. We have the right to repair, which we put in a submission on, which is about whether or not you even have the ability to repair or change any of the computing devices that you have allegedly purchased and now own. What do you even own there? So all of these little pieces all connect to each other, and that can be really tricky to look at when you're only looking in one spot, like if you're just looking at copyright, or if you're just looking at QR code scanning, or COVID Safe app or something like that. You can miss how all of these little pieces can connect together to create a kind of interconnected web of dystopia. The interconnected web is a really good way of putting it, Justin, given the interconnected network is the internet that I suppose centers a lot of our work. I've thought about this in the context of why these different areas of law and different processes would be stepping stones towards something. And I think an easy way for anyone who hasn't quite grappled with the concept of stepping stones to dystopia could see this is, all of this is just to make things easier. All of the technology, all of the legislation that's passed is intended to make things easier. The pause is easier for who? And in many cases, it's easier for individuals because it's convenient, but then it's easier for law enforcement to use these techniques to detect things that they otherwise wouldn't see, and also to make mistakes and visit serious consequences on people who shouldn't have consequences visited on them. So the connection, I think, is the facilitation of ease, and often that's more in line with ease for the government to do things, or ease for the government to make mistakes, as we've seen with robo-debt, for example, than it is ease of life for Australian citizens.
Exactly. And I mean, and even the idea that, do we actually have free speech in this country? Like, do Australians have the constitutional rights to free speech?
Nope. No, we don't. People who are used to watching television from America keep thinking that we have amendments. It's like, we are not subject to the United States Constitution. We have the Australian Constitution, which does not have an explicit right to free speech. Angus, you're the lawyer, so you can explain it in better detail than me, but we only have an implied right to freedom of political speech under very narrow circumstances, is my understanding.
Yeah, under our Constitution, we have a right to political opinion. And unfortunately, mainstream media leads a lot of people towards an understanding that we've got the Fifth and Fourth Amendment privileges like America, and free speech is a right in Australia because that's what our American friends say, and we see that a lot in Hollywood. We don't, as Justin said. There was a decision handed down in the High Court of Australia on the 16th of June, and I think, without doing the lawyer thing and reading judgments and boring people, I think there's a passage in that judgment where a recently appointed Justice Simon Stewart cites Justice Dawson, who's a very well-known and reputable judge in Australia, on the issue of free speech in the Constitution. I'll read a very brief passage of this for everyone because I think it gets to the heart of where we are in Australia. It reads, and I quote, "Whilst it may disappoint some to find that the Australian Constitution provides no guarantee, express or implied, of freedom of speech, that is because those who framed the Constitution considered it to be one of the virtues of representative government that no such guarantee was needed. They took the view that constitutional guarantees operate as a fetter upon the democratic process and did not consider it necessary to restrict the power of Parliament to regulate those liberties which the common law recognises and nurtures." And I take from that the 120 years odd that's passed since the Australian Constitution came into force has seen a significant amount of change in this country and internationally. And one could question the intentions or the belief structures that sat behind those drafters of the Australian Constitution at the time. But one, I don't think even needs to go into that level of critique of the draftsman at the time. All we need to look at is the question of whether Australia in 1901 is the same Australia we have in 2021. And if it's not, then there are some serious things that we should be thinking about changing. A right to free speech, an articulation of human rights in some federal enforceable framework is certainly one of those things, in my view.
Yeah, it's an interesting change of perspective, because on the one hand, society and the world changes a lot. So we do need to update our laws and the way that we operate society to match that. As distinct from encoding certain things that are immutable and should never be changed. Like, well, is freedom of speech one of those things that should never change? And certainly there are some parts of America that have this fundamental thing that is very difficult to change. It requires constitutional amendment. Here, the sort of opposite approach is that, well, look, the politicians will sort it out based on whatever the polity of the day says is the way society should operate. And look, I don't disagree with that perspective, but I think we're not actually having that conversation in Australia. I think that's one of the big problems we have, is that we don't sit here and wrestle with what is the kind of Australia we want. Do we want to be a liberal democracy that values things like freedom of speech? Or do we want to be a nation of cops who want to smack down anyone who steps out of line? And where is the balance between those two things? The right to free speech is not absolute, and that's true even in the United States. The old, it's crying fire in a crowded theatre is the silly example everyone loves to give. But there are certain restraints on speech, and that is required. The tolerance, what's it called, the paradox of tolerance, that you have to be intolerant towards certain ideas in order to maintain tolerance or to maintain a tolerant society. I would like us here in Australia to actually talk about those ideas and deliberately plan what sort of society we want to have, rather than what we've actually done for the last 20 years, which is kind of just drift along one stepping stone after another, and then we'll wake up one day and realize that we've actually constructed a society that looks more like the Chinese Communist Party and less like what we imagine freedom is.
Yeah, absolutely, Justin. Before we talk a little bit about Jordan Shanks, I just want to go to a question that we have at the moment from Mark. So the question is, one of the most effective things that the Electronic Frontiers Foundation, which is the American arm, great organisation, does in the US is taking actions to court where necessary to advocate for digital rights. Does EFA have any experience or plans here? And if not, why not?
Good question. The short answer is we have looked at it briefly. The big problem with that is money. It is very expensive, particularly lawyers. Now, I can't say too much about my personal case, but I am currently I'm currently kind of suing the government. I'm before AAT doing a review of a Freedom of Information request that I made. I am lucky enough to be represented pro bono by some very good lawyers. That kind of activity is a little rare in Australia. We are not as litigious as the Americans. Whether or not that's a good thing remains to be seen. We have a different kind of view of legaldom, and I'll let Angus talk about this a bit more in a moment. For the moment, we haven't done that because mostly we don't think it would be effective given the resourcing that we have available to EFA. And really, that's a reactive approach as well. From my perspective and the things that I've been bringing to the board is that I would like us to get away from being purely reactive to whatever the government decides to do from day to day, and to be more proactive and provide people with things that they can do as individuals and collectively that in many ways actually is as effective, if not more so. Robodebt is one great case where we had both that legal action was taken not by us, but by others. But that only came about after years of grassroots community building, of individuals coming together and deciding to tell the government, no, this must stop. So we can do both of those things. For us at EFA, the approach that we're trying to take at the moment is more on the community building side of things, less about taking lawyers into court and spending lots of money trying to argue with the government. But Angus?
I'm a lawyer, Justin, and I love arguing with government is probably the easy way for me to start this. I agree with you completely, though, from Electronic Frontiers Australia's perspective in a number of different directions. The first is, as you said, the culture of philanthropy and the money that sits behind organisations like Electronic Frontiers Foundation, the American equivalent organisation, is substantially more than what exists in Australia. There is a culture of funding in America that doesn't exist in Australia. And as fun as the David and Goliath battle is in a courtroom, there is a need for something to be able to fuel that process. Even if lawyers are operating pro bono, there are still costs associated with litigation. The second aspect is, I cited from a decision before, which was a High Court decision. It's the decision of Liberty Works and the Commonwealth of Australia. Liberty Works was a public policy think tank and commenced that application in the High Court's original jurisdiction. They lost, and they were ordered to pay the costs of the proceeding. That would end most organisations in Australia because those costs are significant. In America, the regime of costs is very, very different to what we have in Australia. They have a system that effectively uses damages and the award of damages to recompense successful applicants in court proceedings. In Australia, the maximum generally in the Chapter 3 courts is the cost will follow the event. So the loser will pay the winner's costs. So it's not just the cost of paying lawyers, it's the cost associated with the risk of wearing a costs order at the end of a proceeding. And thirdly, America has these fundamental rights entrenched in a constitution that allows them to engage with the courts meaningfully in the way that they do. The same thing in the European Union, where they have a rights framework that allows organisations to test the governments and to test the way that legislation is being passed and could be applied. In Australia, we don't have that same kind of framework. So we're in a very, in my view, immature jurisdiction when it comes to human rights protections, in the sense that there aren't rights available easily in Australia, and the remedies without a right don't follow. So we're in a very different context than our American friends. It's an excellent question, though. And can I make one further point in terms of the concept of introducing rights into the Australian Constitution? I've mused backwards and forwards on whether a constitutional bill like America or an act like New Zealand would be the appropriate way to go. There's pros and cons on both. I agree that no right, human right that is absolute. They're always in competition with each other, and rightfully so. The context and time and social expectations change as different circumstances emerge. In my view, and to take this as a very short summary of that very long-standing, very complicated view, is all we would need to do in Australia is recognise in our constitution the need for Parliament to enact legislation that ratifies completely and fully obligations like the International Covenant on Political and Civil Rights or the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So you create a constitutional requirement that Parliament maintains an act rather than constitutionally enshrining rights for the reasons that Justin just explained. They become too inflexible. But it's a very, very good question. If people are interested in seeing more adversarial work with EFA, there are transcripts and live recordings of the work I've done and many of the other EFA people across the years giving evidence in parliamentary inquiries, which is the closest that we really get to a litigious stance, because that is effectively an adversarial system.
Well, I don't know. I get pretty adversarial on Twitter, so, you know, I'm allowed to for now.
So if we just sort of bring this back to, there are all these like steps that are sort of happening through the legislation and through the sort of stuff that's happening, what's happening with Jordan Shanks, which is obviously going to be very concerning for a lot of people, which we'll talk about in a moment. And we're going to focus a little bit on the fixated persons unit in Queensland. And Angus will be able to tell us a funny story about that. So Justin, can we just talk a little bit about why we should be concerned about what's happening with Jordan Shanks?
Yeah, okay. So this is one of those cases where I'll let Angus deal with the fixated persons unit specifics, but it's largely power was enacted for a particular reason, or that was espoused to be the reason that it was given to police. It's then used in a different context. And we have seen that time and time again with the legislation that gets passed. So a lot of the legislation over the last 20 years, because it really ramped up at around 2001 after the September 11 attacks in the US. So global war on terror was declared, and like many other wars before it, the terror won. The war on drugs, the drugs have pretty much won. So what we got was more terror, but then we also got more responses to that. So it became a kind of authoritarian ratchet, we call it, where every time a power is given, it's never taken away. The problem is never resolved because it's a war on an abstract noun. You can't win one of those, but that's very convenient when you want to accumulate power. So that's the justification for giving increased powers to police to detain someone without either detain them for questioning for a long period of time without representation, without seeing a lawyer, not being able to use electronic devices, not being able to communicate with other people. We've seen it, legislation that was allegedly going to be used only for terrorists was actually used to prosecute people for drug trading. So we've seen that more recently with a whole bunch of bad guys were used legislation that the police have said was the Telecommunications and Other Legislation Assistance and Access Act. They apparently used some of the provisions of that in order to bypass protections that would hide communications for these various people. Some of those actions that were taken by police in Australia are not legal in other jurisdictions. So Australia is actually quite useful in the partnership there. We saw that with a pedophilia site that was uncovered. I think it was originally running in the Netherlands, but that was replatformed to be run out of Australia in Queensland. And the Australian Queensland police essentially ran a child porn site a child sexual abuse material site, essentially ran that for a year, ostensibly to be able to trap bad guys. That legislation was originally supposed to only target specific things, so terrorism was one, but then it expands to be used against child sexual abuse material, and then it often gets expanded off to you for drug trafficking, and then other things in isolated instances, such as Jordan Shanks. There was the case of Dr. Hanif, if I recall correctly, many years ago. Also in around 2014-15, I think it was, ASIC used some website takedown legislation and accidentally knocked 200,000 odd websites off the internet because they blocked an IP address and not a domain name. So not only do we see legislation being used for things that it wasn't originally supposed to be used for, it's also accidentally misused just from ineptness. Or we have individual police. Q Prime database in Queensland, again, was also accessed illegally in order to share information on a specific person who happened to be a mate of the policeman's ex-wife. We've seen the Commonwealth Ombudsman has given us lots of reports of, oh, whoops, we went and looked at a journalist's metadata when we totally weren't supposed to do that without a warrant. Those powers are retained, though. They're never, ever taken away. What we would like to see is that with abuse, there should be consequences. If police abuse those powers, then they should be taken away. At the moment, we don't seem to have a way of being able to remove power once it's actually given over.
Yes, so if we just, for people who may be unaware of it, Jordan Shanks, also known as the Friendly Geordies, is a YouTube citizen journalist. Now, his YouTube producer, Christo Lanker, was pretty much arrested by a plainclothes policeman. He was dragged into his car and he was held overnight under this fixated person. Now, Angus, can you give us a little bit more context as to how this happened and, what's going on with this and why we're so concerned?
Not in the New South Wales context, and probably not wise to do so given there are legal proceedings afoot. And I'm very, very interested to see how they conclude, which I suspected will be a conclusion before a court makes a determination. But in Queensland, I had the opportunity via the Queensland Council for Civil Liberties to ask questions about a similar process or unit in Queensland in 2017. And what arose me to that was a report that was issued by the Police Communications Centre Mental Health Liaison Service Evaluation Report, which was released in May 2016, which described this fixated persons unit, which was the first time I'd heard of such a unit or such a process with such incredibly broad powers embedded within the Queensland Police Service. The Queensland Fixated Persons Unit is equivalent to, or at least it has a similar operation to New South Wales, subject to what the court determines based on the Friendly Geordies saga. The report in Queensland read, the purpose was to based in the Queensland Police Headquarters in Brisbane, was implemented in 2013 and is a joint initiative between the Queensland Police Service and the Queensland Forensic Mental Health Service that identifies fixated individuals through their abnormal communications with public office holders. The unit mitigates the risk posed by these individuals, many of whom who are seriously mentally ill but not receiving treatment, by linking them with mental health interventions and addressing other identified risk factors. Some fixated persons often pose greater risk of harm for themselves and those around them, and therefore the unit also serves a public protection role.
So these are like crazies and lone wolves to sort of deal with that type of people. I think what the origin was from the Link Cafe.
Yes, that's right. So the idea behind these things, and a brochure that runs alongside it says it's specifically not intended to intervene with individuals who merely hold divergent political views, and that not to intervene with individuals who merely hold divergent political views is a direct quote from Queensland's brochure. The intention is, there are people in the community that may have serious mental health problems and may pose a risk generally to themselves and may require intervention. I'm not a mental health worker background, but I couldn't comment on the health aspect of that. But what we've seen with Friendly Geordies is exactly what Justin was just describing. Legislation sets out, or the parameters set by government, is targeted towards one thing, which is the very, very extreme upper end of a problem, like terrorism, which should be something that's prevented. And then it's applied to people that have seemingly communicated with a member of parliament on a very, very limited number of times in the context of a satirical, journalistic-esque presentation on YouTube. And that kind of scope creep is the concern that I hold and Electronic Frontiers holds, and a number of the other civil society organisations across Australia exist for. And that is, even if the legislation as it's passed today isn't intended to be used for reasons other than what's written on the piece of paper, written in the paper by the media, but available on the legislation, the fact that it's open to the executive to use legislation in the future, or to, quite frankly, stuff up how they use the legislation, like sentences fail, like robo-debt, like the ASIC takedown that ended up with a couple of 100,000 websites blocked, that inept approach to legislation or directly incorrect use of legislation based on the terms of Parliament's intention is the thing that we're concerned about. And the safeguard to that, to tie this back to why Jordan Shanks and his crew is so important in Australia at the moment, extends firstly to journalists, who are the people that make the community aware of these issues and aware that these abuses are occurring. And secondly, in Australia, us as the democratic body, us as the body politic. Absent of a human rights framework, we don't have safeguards like America. So we're left effectively to the protection of journalists and to the protection of our abilities to inform ourselves. And unfortunately, some journalists and some social media outlets are not too interested in having people properly informed to be able to vote and properly ensure that the second safeguard can actually work.
And obviously safeguards are so important. Like, I mean, Hong Kong was a liberal democracy. You pass one national security law and they're arresting people and running the press. So, I mean, I think for a lot of us, it's really difficult to understand how just one national security law can cause so much oppression. And I mean, we are seeing it right now in Australia. Justin, what's your take?
Well, the law doesn't operate in a vacuum. So I think like the law is just, it's stuff on pieces of paper. What matters is actually the actions of people. And that's where we're seeing, so to take an example that pivots between those two, that from Angus and what you've just mentioned. So we have QR code contact tracing apps in Australia, which are used to be able to say, you know, you check in when you go to the cafe so that the health department can ring you later if there's an exposure risk.
Yeah.
We had very strong legislation protecting that data passed for the COVID Safe app, which I'm sure people might cast your mind back long enough, you might remember what that was. We now have state-based apps that are not protected in the same way or not with the same strength. The police have accessed that data or attempted to. They attempted to in Victoria. They successfully accessed it in WA, and the reaction from Parliament has been, well, we should remove that access from them. Victoria is still sort of thinking about it. So what we have there is an example of police who were not explicitly prevented from accessing that data, even though the stated intention for the use of this system was it's just for contact tracing, We were all told it'll never be used for anything else.
Yeah.
Yet the police lack the good judgment to act on what they should have done. They're essentially saying that if the law doesn't explicitly prevent us from doing this, we will. That's the problem. So we can write all the laws we like. Lots of stuff is illegal, which of course means it never happens anymore. What's written down is not quite so important as the behaviour of the humans tasked with enforcing and upholding the ideals that we have as a society. And that comes down to all of us, but it's also the people who are entrusted with power.
Yeah.
What I think we aren't doing very well in Australia is having a real discussion about power and the systems of power.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we at EFA are trying to do about that, and what we have seen work successfully, is that when people gather together and harness collective power, that can act as a check against the power of these institutions and systems, like Centrelink with Robodebt, like the outcry before COVID Safe app came in that forced the government to make sure that we passed good legislation. Similarly, when My Health Record was originally coming in, there was strong outcry to make sure that there is an opt-out option and that if you opt out, your data would actually get deleted. That came about through collective action and collective outrage. Yeah. We're not seeing that happen across the full spectrum of this legislation, of all these different pieces, partly because it's complicated and hard, and partly because I think there are certain elements of society that quite like power and would like to have a lot more.
Yeah.
And we need to be talking about that much more explicitly.
Yeah.
Specifically about what actually happens, not what people intended to happen.
So we've got a couple of questions. We thought we might just cover that from Rich. So what is the next step? He's got, I feel I have the information I need. Educating others is the next step. Is there any proposed legislations or constitutional amendments that we can lobby with?
Now, Angus, I know that we've got a couple of submissions coming up, so this is an ideal opportunity to get involved with those.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I think the overarching point that you make there about educating others is the bit that I'll pick up on and really reinforce and amplify the hardest. As Justin just said, change happens when you get people together in a group, and change like the My Health Record, or change like the census, and change like the COVID Safe app comes from people being together and sharing a common view that something is not acceptable. Educating others doesn't mean ramming beliefs down someone's throat. It's just having a conversation about, hey, are you aware that these things are happening, and do you agree with them? If people agree with them, then that's a part of living in a democracy, and that's completely acceptable. If people don't agree with them, then at least people are aware that there's something they don't agree with. If people don't know, that's the most dangerous thing for a democracy, in my view. So education, I think, is the key point there. In terms of constitutional amendments that we can lobby with, I approach the idea of a constitutional referendum in Australia with a great degree of skepticism, because I think if there's going to be a constitutional referendum about one thing, there are a lot of other things that the Constitution could change at the moment. For example, First Nations people should be more appropriately represented in Australia at a constitutional level than they currently are. And it was only 60 years ago that those people, slightly more than 60 years ago, those people, the traditional custodians, were specifically excluded from the democratic process in Australia. So I think if we're going to talk about constitutional amendments, that's something that would come on the table at the same time as free speech or political opinion being revisited. There is currently an inquiry in the Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee, which we can put up, or I'll drop a link into the chat for everyone if you would like a direct example of where you can start making submissions. This is an inquiry that I think will have the traction of starting to have a real conversation about constitutional amendment that incorporates human rights. I don't think that we should allow government to limit that to free speech and political opinion. I think this is a prime opportunity to be having a conversation about all human rights that exist, both the civil and political and the economic, social and cultural rights, and a way that we could ratchet that into the Australian Constitution. As I said before, an easy referendum question could be, should Australia pass a constitutional requirement that requires Australia to have, for the good governance of the community, a complete ratification of international law relating to human rights? That, I think, is a question that doesn't individually ask questions about human rights, but broadens out beyond just the the free speech and political opinion.
Yeah.
In terms of other inquiries that are currently on, because there's another one that I think is just as important as constitutional change, the Trusted Digital Identity Framework has progressed to the point where there is digital identity consultation at the moment in terms of what Australia or Australian citizens being ascribed a digital identity means and what that would look like. There is enormous convenience and enormous ease that exists for Australians, and there is a great benefit of having the ability to access your identity without having to prove 100 points every time that you go and use a government service. There is also an incredibly dangerous proposition being put there that the government honeypots all Australians' identity. And if there's an attack on Australia, the potential identity theft there is enormous. The potential misuse of that information as well, where you start recording more and more about Australians as effectively your token on your religious beliefs, for example, or where you went for dinner last night. Those kind of things in building a digital identity are really, really important as to how far we're willing to bargain with the government and how much we trust the government with respect to our identity. I encourage you to follow EFA as well, because we frequently post on the website upcoming submissions and submissions that we're making. And where our website is slow, Justin's Twitter is certainly not.
Absolutely. And just moving on from this, we have another question. And I guess what people are asking here is that they'd like 2 or 3 stepping stones currently being paved that we can act on and step away from dystopia. And that's from Felicity. So, Justin.
I can take that one if you don't mind.
You start, I'll finish off.
Very good. That's a great question. Flick, the easiest stepping stones we're on is in 2013, we introduced the concept of mandatory metadata retention, which is retaining data about data, not what's written on an envelope like the person who introduced that bill thought metadata meant. That was not content, and that was intended only to be used in criminal law enforcement. A strong lobby means that there is now a requirement for journalistic information warrants to issue. As Justin said, that doesn't happen anyway. So it's effectively a warrantless access to metadata. You jump 5 years, we have the introduction of the assistance and access legislation, which allows government effectively a side door into the most extremely broadly categorized concept of designated communications providers, which is anything under the sun, or even anything not under the sun, that has an end user and uses an electronic service and allows government effectively their way into electronic systems for the purpose of content monitoring or acquiring more information about people. You jump 2 years from that, and the Identify and Disrupt legislation has been introduced and is currently before the Parliament that allows government to disrupt data, which I'm sure they don't intend this to mean alter evidence in the course of criminally prosecuting someone, but data disruption warrants could certainly have that effect. It allows the government to take over accounts, as Justin gave the example about the playpen operation. Taking over accounts and pretending to be something that law enforcement isn't is extremely dangerous. And thirdly, allows law enforcement to monitor network activity and detect connections between people. What we started with the metadata retention regime, and why EFA lobbied with a number of other organisations so heavily against that, is that was the start of a very serious slipping slide that ends in a situation where government is entitled to do and see whatever they like with you, while you're not able to do and see whatever you like with government. They are 3 easy steps that I can see that are paving us on our way to a very dystopic future. And we don't have a safeguard against that. In fact, it seems like we're just pouring oil on that slipping side. We're not doing anything to slow ourselves. Steps that could be taken against that is talk to people about these things. As I said, the final check that we have, the final balance that exists in this country is these governments have to be elected every 4 years. These governments have to take themselves to the people and have to sell to the people that they're still relevant. Get rid of them. Make a strong message with the community that these kind of legislation or developments are intolerable and unacceptable and should be stopped and repealed.
Yeah, excellent. We've just got a question that we've just got in from Troy. He's got, hi, as of next month, the single touch payroll system is mandatory for all business and reporting is only possible through white listed companies in the private sector. Businesses waive liability in the T's and C's signing up to one, and the ATO said if they themselves are not liable with respect to the provider chosen, yet there is no choice but to choose one. Wondering if anyone might speak to the implications around liability and the TFN theft and leakage.
It's a tricky one, in the STP is quite a nuanced and detailed issue, so I won't try to talk about that too specifically. I'll take the privacy aspect of it and the failure side of things, which will tap into what can you do. So on this, one of the things that we can do when we're talking about this kind of situation, or any of them, is to ask, well, what if this goes wrong? What we don't see in any legislation is, well, what happens when you don't live up to the ideals? What happens when these powers are abused? So I gave some examples earlier. This is a privacy thing. So what happens if my TFN leaks? Back in 2014, I think it was, the Australian Law Reform Commission proposed a tort of serious breach of privacy, which was something that you as an individual could essentially sue another party, be it a company or potentially government, for breaching your privacy in a serious manner. So it's not frivolous lawsuits. This is, when it's a big deal. I think that is something that we should all encourage to be passed, because then at the moment we are basically at the mercy of regulators who are, in the case of the Information Commissioner, chronically underfunded. I would go so far as to say deliberately so. And that's pretty much all we can do. There is no individual ability to go and sue, and the collective right to go and do a class action is also quite limited because of the legal remedies that are available. So we need to gather together to demand that we can have this kind of remedy to be able to stop these abuses and ensure that there are consequences for those abuses, which again goes to what Angus was talking about. There is a review into the Privacy Act happening at the moment. So this is an opportunity for all of us to come together and demand, as we have for many years. This is consistently supported by the vast majority of Australians. We want government to provide greater privacy protections than we currently have.
Absolutely.
At the moment, the government seems to be stampeding towards becoming more like Facebook. We all hate the fact that Facebook surveils us constantly and is spying on us all the time. So make that message to your friends loud and clear that they don't have to accept this. So have those conversations with other people. Make them feel that, yes, your privacy is important, it is valuable, and it is right for you to believe that. And for all of us to then demand that government does better. We're not just saying that they should, don't do any of these things. What we're actually saying is, government, we need you to be very good at technology. We need you to be good at computers. We need things like Centrelink to help us, not hurt us. We need My Health Record to respect our privacy and not sell our medical information to researchers. But we would actually really like to be able to quickly and easily find out whether we've had all of our vaccinations or not. This technology should be there to help us, not to hurt us. So we need to spend more of our time educating each other, I think, on where the legislation doesn't actually give you the protections you think it does. And when that makes you angry, is to take action. Ring your MPs, vote accordingly, speak to other people and help them to understand how they can learn more about this and to protect themselves. Take small actions every day.
Absolutely. So what we're seeing here is that with great powers comes great responsibility. And that responsibility includes, as you have mentioned before, Justin, is taking away the power when it's abused. We know that we want a tort of privacy breach. So if the government abuses their power, you should be able to sue them individually and collectively. And as Justin pointed out, and Angus as well, we need to have this conversation in Australia about the use of this power, particularly surveillance and all these things that they're passing. It's a problem. The fixated person, we will put you in a van and we'll stick a needle in your arm. And this is pretty much what can happen as we see right now. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. And again, as Justin is saying, why can't we have technology that helps us rather than hurts us? Why can't we should be highlighting power and its abuse. It's a choice, and we should be forcing our governments to make better choices. Now, at EFA and other groups like us, this is what we are trying to do. And there's been so many of us from before that just keep carrying this torch forward. So before we wrap up, Justin, can we talk a little bit about the EFA campaign at the moment so everyone can contribute?
Sure. We have a little end of financial year fundraiser going on. We are, unfortunately, we don't have tax deduction status for various reasons that are, again, sort of in the news recently. The government likes to try to threaten charities with deregistration and so on. So we're not a registered charity. We are a not-for-profit. We do have, we don't have to pay tax on the money. You unfortunately do. It's not tax deductible gift, but that money allows us to take it to the government. We are not particularly scared of them taking away our accreditation because we don't have it. Whether we change that in the future remains to be seen, maybe if they start to back off. So if you could donate money that, if we find our services valuable and you value digital rights, please do donate. It does help us a lot to be able to try to expand the activities that we do, activities like this. We would like to be able to have a lot more of these kinds of activities going on. So,
and where can people donate, Justin?
So if you go along to chuffed.org, you will see the website, or go onto Twitter or our website, efa.org.au, and you'll see links to the campaign there where you can donate money. And if you don't have some spare money, the best thing you can do is to give time. So if you would rather volunteer with your time rather than giving us cash, we'd be more than happy to talk to you about what you can help us do.
Absolutely. And thank you everyone for your questions, and also the really nice comments in the chat has been really great too. We are so blessed to have so many members and so much support, and we will continue to do this great work. So we're going to unfortunately have to end. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us. Our panelists, Justin Warren, Angus Murray. A big thank you to ThoughtWorks and Robin for your ongoing support to make these talks happen. EFA Talks will be back next month. Now, if you're not a member, please join us. Check out our website, efa.org.au. Please make a donation. We are an independent, non-profit association that relies on membership, subscription and donations. If you're concerned about digital rights, please jump on board. Please get in contact with us through the website. We're really interested in your concerns, your questions, things and topics that you'd like us to cover. We are here for our members. And thank you for joining us today on our EFA Talks. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.